Like many new business ventures, technology projects, on average, have a low success rate. There's a growing body of data that show roughly half of IT projects end in failure. A recent IBM survey revealed that only 40% of projects met schedule, budget, and quality goals, and the underestimation of complexity listed as a factor in 35% of projects. Another survey by KMPG showed an incredible 70% of organizations suffered at least one project failure in the prior 12 months. Moreover, 50% of respondents also indicated that their project failed to consistently achieve the initial objectives, and 49% of organizations had suffered a recent project failure. There is a place as vast as space and as timeless as infinity, the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area we call Tales from the IT Trenches.
So early on in my career, way before I ever worked for BitWizards, at a small consulting company, I was working for a large enterprise client, and one of their problems was that they had an access database, like so many organizations did, building departmental access databases that really should have been client-server applications. So I was migrating an access database to a client-server application, and in the process of architecting their solution, we determined that they needed a SQL Server backend. And of course I asked if they had a database administration group, who do I need to work with to deploy a SQL Server database, and my contact really blocked me from discussing anything with anybody else in the company. She really had to be the go-to and to communicate, and I don't think she knew the right questions to ask, and so she didn't find a database group, and so she didn't find the answers for me about whether they had a naming convention and what rules I really needed to follow in the development of my database. So when it was time for us to deploy the database, and I came in to really work with their group to get the server stood up and deploy the database, I found out they really had a database administration group and they had naming conventions. So back to the drawing board, I had to refactor the entire database and the application where any of those connections were made. And it took about 2 weeks, and the client wasn't happy because it was an additional 2 weeks of work, but there was really nothing I could do but to follow those. Well, it also turned out that in the midst of this, they were revamping their naming convention, so it wasn't solid to begin with. They gave it to me to deploy and then redid it. So although this project finally ended up getting off the runway and being a success, communication and collaboration is often a problem and a cause of project failure.
One particular horror story really stands out in my mind that happened back in 2004. And the company was a reasonably mature company at this point. They were doing about $2 million in business a month through mail order marketing, online infomercial sales, and web sales. And when they'd started, they built a system on Microsoft Access and did not have the vision that as their company grew that they would have to scale this Access application out. And over time, it had become a Frankenstein where people had bolted on different things like the CEO's wife's Christmas list and other things. And so for a software development shop coming in behind the scenes and how to take this existing system and get the data that's business critical out of it and into an enterprise class system and scale it, there's a lot of baggage that had to be gone through. And so they came to us, engaged us to come in and do some consulting for them. And some of the initial things that we saw that were just absolutely scary to us was they had no backups of this system. And it was over 6 gigabytes in size, which is a limit in Access in terms of size of database. It gets up to 6 gig. And so in order to allow their telemarketers and the call-ins to be able to work, they basically had an office manager that was coming in at 6 a.m. every morning and compressing and compacting the database so that it would be able to function at 9 o'clock in the morning when all of these 200 telemarketers came in to utilize it. And so we consulted with them and said, hey, the first thing you've got to do is get your infrastructure in place. You need to get some backups, because if you lose this database, you're in trouble. And then we need to architect the system on Microsoft SQL Server and have a solid .NET front end that would scale with your organization. In the end, the organization again stayed on the path that they were on, thinking short-sightedly and not really thinking about the long-term investment of their business, and chose to move on in the same direction that they were already going. And a few months later, they actually had a major failure of that database, and they lost, the last backup they had was about 4 months prior to that, so they lost basically $8 million worth of orders. And in terms of a business that continually reconnects with customers, that was a huge loss. Another thing was that they actually had credit cards stored in that database, which was a huge liability for that company. And now they had to go back on all of their recurring orders and reach out to all of those customers and re-get that information. Very scary. And very short-sighted. So if I had to give people advice, especially growing businesses, I think that instead of looking at short-term gains, you really need to look at the strategic benefits and don't end up with your project in a horror story like this one.
Software development project failures, but I have a story that's just, I mean, it's really heartbreaking. When I worked for a software development firm in Austin, I knew a fellow who ran a small business selling point-of-sale systems to small retail stores. Basically, he was being held hostage by a large company, always having to pay royalties, so he decided to build his own software application and then draw that money for himself. So he mortgaged his house in order to get this software done. And the project ran long, it went over budget. Then right as it gets released and he's at his wit's end as far as financing the project, Microsoft and Intuit both come out with a point of sale competing product. And so now he actually has these two heavyweights competing with him as well. On top of that, the software development firm that had built the software for him started competing with him directly with the software he had paid to have built, because his agreement was a licensing fee and not ownership of the software. And litigation, which was another expense for him. It was really just a heartbreaking story. And this wasn't, you know, people think of it as a company. This is an individual who financed this out of his own pocket. And I tell you, it was a heartbreaking story. Microsoft and Intuit were not quiet about the fact that they were putting this out. You know, a little bit of market research might have gone a long way to help save him. On the flip side, you know, a good attorney to look over a contract. I mean, not owning the software that you're paying to have built was a hindrance. I think it was a little bit unreputable for the software company to have done that, but you have to protect yourself.
Sometimes technology feels like you are traveling through another dimension, not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. The signposts are not always clear. Partner with the wise wizards to ensure you reach the proper destination. For Bit Wizards, I'm Jonathan Clark.
Ha 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 ha!